The rain arrived without warning that March night, as things that change everything often do. It fell finely, almost invisible, more like an icy mist that clung to the skin and slowly seeped into the bones, unhurriedly, as if it knew it had the whole night ahead of it. And in the midst of that rain, on the edge of the dirt road that connected the village of Colinas Baixas to the state highway, a woman walked barefoot, with one child in her arms and another clinging to the hem of her dress. Her name was Clara. I was 32 years old, but that night I felt like I'd lived twice as long. My long, dark hair was plastered to my face, and my eyes, large, brown, the kind that hold on to everything without ever giving anything back, were dry. I wasn't crying. I'd been past that stage a long time ago. Crying was a luxury for someone who still hoped to be heard, and Clara had forgotten that hope like one forgets how to walk after breaking both legs. The boy in her lap, Pedro, was 3 years old. He slept with his face buried in his mother's neck, his small body trembling with every gust of wind. The girl, Luisa, 6 years old, walked silently, gripping the hem of Clara's dress tightly, her bare feet sinking into the mud. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't complain. Children who grow up in homes where silence is the only form of security learn early on that asking questions can be dangerous. 3 hours earlier, Clara's husband had opened the front door and thrown out the bag containing her and the children's clothes. He didn't shout. He didn't need to shout. Renato's voice was the kind that hurts more when it's low. He simply said, "Don't come back." And he closed the door. He locked it. He turned off the porch light. And that was all. 7 years of marriage ended like this. No explanation, no final argument, not even the dignity of a dramatic scene. Just a closed door, a bag on the porch, and the sound of rain beginning to fall. Clara knew it was coming. She knew it the same way one knows winter is coming. Not because someone warns, but because the cold begins to settle in the corners of the house, in glances, in the spaces between words that no one speaks anymore. Renato had changed slowly over the years, or perhaps he had always been like that, and she had just taken longer to see it. In the beginning, he was enchanting. He knew the right words, knew when to touch, when to smile, when to make promises that sounded like absolute truths. He said he would take care of her. He said he would never leave her alone. He said she was everything he needed. And Clara, who had grown up in a house where no one ever said anything like that, believed him. Clara's mother died when she was 11. Her father drank. Her siblings scattered to distant cities, each carrying their own pain as best they could. Clara stayed. She stayed taking care of her father. The house, the silence. She grew up being useful because being useful was the only way she knew how to be loved. She washed, cooked, cleaned, sewed, kept quiet. When Renato appeared, 25 years old with his clean truck and his easy smile, Clara thought life was finally going right. She thought the universe was rewarding her patience. They got married in a simple registry office on a Tuesday in September. Clara wore a white dress that she had sewn herself. Renato brought flowers. There were 3 witnesses, none of them from her family. After the ceremony, they went to the house that Renato had inherited from his grandfather, an old building at the end of a dirt road, with a large yard and a porch with a wooden bench. Clara looked at that house and felt something she hadn't felt since childhood, belonging. She felt she had finally found her place. The first year was good, not perfect, but good. Renato worked at the local sawmill, leaving early and returning tired. Clara cleaned the house, cooked, and tended the yard. They didn't talk much, but there was a peace in that silence that seemed sufficient. When Luisa was born, Clara felt that the world finally made sense. She held that little girl in her arms and thought, "Now I have a reason that no one can take away from me." But Renato didn't react as she expected. He looked at his daughter, nodded, and said he needed to sleep because he had work early. Clara swallowed her disappointment like someone swallowing a bitter pill, quickly, without chewing, so as not to taste it. She told herself it was tiredness, that it was worrying about the bills, that it was just his way. She told herself so many things that she almost believed them. Over time, Renato became the center of a house that revolved around his mood. If he woke up feeling good, the day was peaceful. If he woke up feeling bad, everything was wrong. The food was bland. The floor was dirty. The girl cried too much. Clara didn't do anything right. The words came slowly at first, nudges disguised as observations. "You've gained weight. My mother made better rice. If you were smarter, you would have finished your studies." Clara absorbed everything without responding. She had learned from a young age that responding only makes things worse. Silence was her armor, and she wore that armor every day like a uniform. When Pedro was born, Renato was already sleeping in the back room. He said the baby's crying bothered him. He said he needed space. He said Clara was suffocating him. And she, with a newborn in her arms and a 3-year-old girl clinging to her leg, agreed. He agreed because agreeing was easier than fighting. She agreed because the energy she had left needed to be reserved for the children, not for battles she knew she would never win. The neighbors saw nothing. Renato was friendly with everyone. He greeted people, helped change tires, lent tools. He had the kind of smile that makes people think they know who he is. Clara, on the other hand, was discreet, almost invisible. The neighbors saw her hanging clothes on the line, sweeping the sidewalk, taking the children to school. She didn't talk much. She didn't complain. She didn't smile. But nobody found it strange because silent women are invisible in a small town. They are part of the landscape, like lampposts or wire fences. The day Renato kicked her out was no different from any other. Clara had prepared dinner, bathed the children, and tidied the kitchen. She was sitting in the living room, sewing a hem on her trousers. Luisa, when he entered, he smelled of beer and a strange perfume. He stopped at the door, looked at her as one looks at a piece of furniture that no longer matches the decor, and said, "Pack your things. I want you to leave." Clara didn't look up from her sewing, not because she hadn't heard, but because she needed a second to process the pain without showing it. She breathed. She finished the stitch. She cut the thread with her teeth. Only then did she look at him. "The children are sleeping," she said. It wasn't an objection. It was a fact. The only language she still mastered. Renato didn't answer. He went to the room, grabbed the bag that was already packed. It was already packed, Clara realized, which meant it wasn't an impulse, it was a plan, and threw it onto the balcony. "When I get back, I don't want you here." And he left. The truck's engine roared in the night. Its headlights pierced the darkness, and then there was only silence. Clara sat for another 10 minutes. The needle was still in her hand, Louisa's pants in her lap. She looked at the house, at the walls she herself had painted, at the curtains she herself had sewn, at the children's height marks scratched on the kitchen door frame. All of it was hers, and none of it was hers. The house was in Renato's name. Everything was in Renato's name. Clara had no property deeds, no bank account, not even an address she could call her own. She had only 2 children and a bag of clothes. He woke the children carefully. Louisa opened her eyes, startled, and Clara simply said, "Let's go for a walk." The kindest lie you've ever told. She dressed the still sleeping Pedro, put the bag on her back, and left through the back door. Not the front. The front was where the neighbors could see, and Clara didn't want to be seen. Not out of shame, but because being seen would mean having to explain, and explaining would mean admitting aloud what she was trying not to feel. The dirt road was long and dark. There were no streetlights after the last house in the village. The only sounds were her footsteps in the mud, Pedro's heavy breathing as he slept, and the rain, which was now falling harder, as if the sky had decided to cry for her. Louisa walked without complaining. At one point she squeezed her mother's hand and said, "It's cold, Mom." Clara took off her coat and put it over her daughter's shoulders. She kept her arms outstretched, feeling the cold cut into her skin, and continued walking. I didn't know where I was going. There was no plan. There was no destination. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking at that moment was too dangerous. So I walked, one step after another, the mud between my toes, Pedro's weight in my arms, Luisa's hand holding the hem of my dress, and the road stretching ahead like a promise no one made. That's how the sheriff found her. His name was Samuel Moreira. I was 47 years old, with a gray mustache, large hands, and a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of every sad story I had ever heard in that region. He had been sheriff of Colinas Baixas for 12 years, and before that, he had been a soldier, then a highway patrolman, then many things he didn't like to remember. He had a scar on his chin from an old accident, and another invisible scar, the one that remained after he lost his wife to an illness no doctor could name 6 years earlier. Since then, he had lived alone in a house in the center of the village, with an old dog named Trovão, and a routine that repeated itself like the ticking of a clock no one needs. That night, Samuel was making his usual rounds. The patrol car drove along the dirt road with its headlights low, the windshield wipers working slowly against the rain. He liked these night patrols. The silence, the empty road, the sound of the engine. It was in those moments that he felt least alone, paradoxically, because chosen solitude is different from imposed solitude. The headlights illuminated the bag first, then the silhouette of a woman carrying something in her arms, then the little girl walking beside her. Samuel slowed down. The image didn't make sense at that moment, in that rain, on that road. He pulled over, opened the door, and stood beside the car, the rain soaking his hat. Clara stopped when she saw the police car. Instinctively, she pulled Luisa closer and hugged Pedro tightly. Not out of fear of Samuel, she didn't even know who he was, but because the reflex of a woman who has been beaten down by life is always to protect first, ask questions later. Samuel walked slowly toward her, like one walks toward a frightened animal that might flee at any sudden movement. He stopped 2 meters away. He looked at her bare feet, her soaked dress, the children. He didn't say, "What happened?" He didn't say, "Do you need help?" He didn't ask any of the questions a uniformed man normally asks. He looked into her eyes, and it was like looking into a deep well where someone had thrown all the stars that never came to be. He took off his hat. The rain wet his gray hair. And he said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Come with me." 2 words. Just 2. But they were said in a way Clara had never heard before, without demands, without conditions, without the expectation of gratitude. They were said as if offering shelter to someone in the rain was the most natural thing in the world, as natural as breathing. Clara didn't answer. He had no words available at that moment, but his feet moved, and that was answer enough. Samuel opened the back door of the car, and Clara got in with Pedro in her arms. Louisa climbed in on the other side, and Samuel placed the bag on the front seat. He turned on the heater. He didn't ask any questions. He drove in silence down the road back to the village, and the only sounds inside the car were the children's breathing and the heater blowing warm air. He took them to his house. Not to the police station, not to a shelter, not to some acquaintance's house, to his own house. He opened the door, turned on the lights, and Travone came to greet them with his tail wagging slowly like old dogs who have seen it all. Samuel pointed to the guest room, a simple room with a single bed and a mattress on the floor, and said, "There are towels in the closet. We'll talk tomorrow." And he went to the kitchen. Clara put Pedro to bed. The boy continued sleeping, oblivious to everything, with the ability that only very young children have to sleep in the midst of disaster. Louisa sat on the mattress and looked at her mother with those big eyes that were an exact copy of Clara's. "Are we going to live here?" she asked. Clara knelt in front of her daughter, smoothed her wet hair, and said, "For now, we are safe. That's enough." When she left the room, she found Samuel in the kitchen. He was heating milk on the stove. There were 2 glasses on the table and a plate of crackers. It wasn't a feast, but it was more than Clara had expected to receive from anyone that night. She sat down. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from that trembling that comes when the body finally understands that it can stop fighting for a moment. Samuel served the milk. He sat down on the other side of the table. Thunder lay down at his feet, and for long minutes no one said anything. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who understand that not everything needs to be said to be understood. Clara spoke first. "My husband sent me away." She said it as if saying that the weather had changed or that the milk had run out. A fact. No drama, no tears, no need to elicit pity. Samuel nodded. "I know who your husband is." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Clara understood that in a small town the sheriff knows things that nobody else talks about. "I have nowhere to go," Clara said. And that was the hardest sentence he had ever uttered in his life. Not because it was complicated, but because admitting aloud that you are completely alone in the world is like ripping a bandage off a wound that never healed. "You have it today," Samuel replied. "We'll see tomorrow." Clara drank the milk. She ate 2 biscuits. And for the first time in years, she tasted the food. Not because the milk was special or the biscuits were good, but because someone had prepared it for her without her having to ask, without her having to deserve it. That night, Clara lay on the single bed in the guest room with Pedro curled up beside her and Louisa sleeping on the mattress. The ceiling was low, the walls had a leak in the right corner, and the mattress was hard. But it was a ceiling, it was walls, it was a place where the rain didn't get in, and Clara, who had spent years living in a beautiful house that was never hers, discovered in that simple room something she hadn't felt since childhood, the feeling of being protected. The following days were strange in the way mornings after a storm are strange. Everything seems the same, but something has shifted. Clara woke up early, as she always did, and when she left her room, she found Samuel already in the kitchen making coffee. He didn't ask how she had slept. He didn't force a conversation. He simply put a cup on the table and went to work. Louisa and Pedro discovered Travone, and the dog, who hadn't received attention from children in years, seemed to have rejuvenated 10 years overnight. Clara began cleaning the house. Not because anyone asked, but because it was what she knew how to do, and doing something was better than standing still thinking. Samuel's house was the house of a lonely man, functional, clean enough, but without any sign of affection or attention. The curtains were old, the pots were burnt at the bottom, the plants in the yard were dry. Clara took care of everything, slowly, without asking permission, without announcing. And Samuel noticed every detail. He noticed the change, but didn't comment. When he saw the new curtains, sewn from scraps Clara had found in a corner of the closet, he just stood there in the room for a moment, looking like someone rediscovering a room they thought they knew. The town began to talk, as small towns always do. The sheriff took a woman into his home, a married woman, with children. The comments came disguised as concern. "Is this right? What will her husband think? Shouldn't she look for her family?" Samuel listened to everything with the same expression as someone listening to the wind. He paid attention, but didn't let it change direction. Renato showed up on the 3rd day. She parked the truck in front of Samuel's house, got out with her chest puffed out, and knocked on the door. Clara was in the kitchen, washing dishes. He heard the knock, and his whole body stiffened. That sound, fists against wood, was the sound that preceded everything bad in her life. Louisa ran to her room and hid behind the bed. Pedro started to cry. Samuel opened the door. Renato was taller, younger, stronger. But Samuel had something Renato never had and never would have, an authority that doesn't come from physical size, but from the weight of his presence. He stood in the doorway, filling the entire space with his silence, and waited. "I came to get my wife," Renato said. Samuel didn't move. "She's not yours. People aren't property. I have rights. You have duties, and you failed at all of them." Renato clenched his fists, his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. For a moment it seemed he was going to lunge forward, but there was something in Samuel's gaze. Not a threat, not anger, just an absolute, unwavering firmness, the kind built over decades of facing what needs to be faced, that made Renato hesitate. And men like Renato, who they know how to function when they have power over someone, but they don't know what to do when they encounter someone who isn't intimidated. "This isn't over," Renato said. He got back into the truck. He started the engine, and he drove away, kicking up dust like someone trying to make a dramatic exit that no one applauds. Samuel closed the door. He went to the kitchen. Clara was standing with her back to him, her hands immersed in the sink water, her shoulders trembling. He didn't touch her. He didn't say everything was all right, because it wasn't, and he wasn't the type to lie to comfort someone. He just leaned against the doorframe and said, "He's not coming in here." Clara nodded. A tear fell into the dishwater and dissolved without anyone noticing. The weeks went by. Clara and the children stayed at Samuel's house, and what was temporary began to take on the texture of daily life. Louisa started attending the village school. Pedro played in the yard with Trovão. Clara cooked, sewed, took care of the house, and little by little she also began to take care of herself, not with grand gestures, but with small permissions. She granted herself to calmly comb her hair, to drink her coffee sitting down instead of standing, to look out the window for no reason. Samuel kept a respectful distance. He slept in his room at the other end of the house. They ate dinner together, but the conversation was always about practical things. Louisa's school, the roof repair, the price of beans. There was no flirting, no innuendo, none of those games that men and women usually play when attraction begins to grow, and perhaps that was precisely why something different was growing between them, something slower, deeper, more real than anything Clara had ever experienced. One night, after the children were asleep, Clara found Samuel sitting on the back porch, gazing at the sky. Thunder was beside him, asleep. She sat at the other end of the bench, he kept the distance he had learned to maintain from everything, and continued gazing at the same sky. "Did your wife like stars?" Clara asked. She didn't know where the question came from. Perhaps from the silence, which sometimes produces more honest questions than any planned conversation. Samuel took a while to answer. "I liked everything," he said, and his voice changed in an almost imperceptible way. It became softer, as happens when you talk about someone who still lives inside you. "I liked cooking, singing in the shower, dancing without music. I liked living." He paused. "Her name was Marta." Clara waited. She wasn't in a hurry. She had learned that the most important stories are told slowly, and that interrupting a pain that is unfolding is like stepping on a flower that is blooming. "She suddenly became ill," Samuel continued. "One day she was singing in the kitchen. The next she couldn't get up. The doctors ran tests, used complicated words, and in the end no one could really explain it properly. It was 8 months. 8 months in the hospital, waiting, making apologetic promises with their eyes. She died on a Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand. And when she stopped breathing, I felt a part of me stop too." Clara didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say anything. She just stood there on the same bench, under the same stars, and her silent presence was more comforting than any words she could have chosen. Samuel glanced at her, quickly, fleetingly, like someone stealing something they're not sure they can have, and saw in her eyes something he didn't see anywhere else. Understanding. Not pity, not curiosity, not judgment. Understanding. The kind that only exists between people who know the pain of losing something they loved. Time did what time does, softening the rough edges of things, rearranging everyone's inner workings. "Clara." She began to smile. Not big smiles, not hearty laughs, but small twitches at the corners of her mouth that appeared when Louisa told a funny story about school, or when Pedro chased Trovão around the yard, or when she and Samuel crossed paths in the kitchen and their eyes met for a second longer than necessary. Clara had a talent that no one ever appreciated. She sewed as if telling stories with her hands. It wasn't ordinary sewing. It was something that transformed fabric into art. She embroidered flowers that looked real, made patchwork dresses that resembled expensive boutique pieces, and repaired clothes in ways that made them better than when they were new. Renato never paid any attention to it. He called it an idle hobby. But one Sunday morning, Samuel stopped at the living room door and watched Clara embroider a tablecloth. He stood there for several minutes in silence until she noticed and looked up. "That's beautiful," he said. Just like that. 2 words no man had ever said to her in her entire adult life. "That's beautiful." Clara felt something stir inside her chest, something that had been dormant for so long she didn't even remember it existed. It was the feeling of being seen, not looked at, seen, truly seen, in the sense of someone recognizing that she was more than a function, more than a utility, more than hands that wash, cook, and clean. She was someone who created beauty, and someone finally noticed. In the following days, Clara began to sew with more enthusiasm. She made new curtains for the living room, a tablecloth embroidered with sunflowers, an apron for Samuel that he wore without comment but never took off again. She started taking orders from neighbors. An alteration here, a hem there, a dress for Donna Teresa's daughter who was going to make her first communion. The money was little, but it was hers. It was the first thing that was truly hers in years. The dynamics of the house changed so organically that neither of them noticed it happening. Clara stopped calling the room the guest room and started calling it our room when talking to the children. Samuel stopped eating dinner in silence and started telling stories from work, small, funny incidents, seemingly insignificant, but which had the effect of making Clara feel included in a life that was no longer just his. Louisa started asking Samuel for help with her homework. Pedro started calling Trovone my dog, and the house, which for 6 years had only been the place where Samuel slept, began to feel like a home. But not everything was simple. The town continued to talk. The priest mentioned in his Sunday sermon, without naming names, that the sacrament of matrimony is sacred and indissoluble. Some mothers at Luisa's school distanced themselves from Clara as if her situation were contagious. And Renato, although he hadn't returned to Samuel's house, spread the word around town that Clara had abandoned him, that she had run away with another man, that she was ungrateful and irresponsible. His version was easier to believe than the truth, because the lie was simple and the truth was complicated, and people generally prefer what requires no effort to understand. Clara felt the weight of those stares. Every trip to the bakery was an exercise in resistance. Every line at the corner store was an exposure. She lowered her head, bought what she needed, and returned quickly. She didn't complain, didn't justify herself, didn't try to convince anyone. She carried that pain the same way she had always carried all the others, inside, silently, in the place where no one sees. Samuel noticed. He noticed the way Clara came back from shopping with her eyes looking duller, the way she shrugged when someone passed by, the way she checked the door 3 times before going to sleep. And one night, after dinner, while Clara was washing the dishes and he was drying them, she said something that changed everything. "You owe nothing to the city." Clara continued washing, her hands in the hot water, her eyes on the plate. "You didn't do anything wrong," he continued, "and the people who say you did never did anything right." Clara stopped. She put the plate down in the sink. And for the first time since arriving at that house, she cried. Not with sobs, not dramatically, but with silent tears that streamed down her face like the rain of that day. First night, thin, constant, impossible to stop. She cried for everything, for the lost marriage, for the wasted youth, for the love she never received, for the dignity that was stolen, for the years she spent thinking the problem was her. She cried for all the times she swallowed her tears, for all the times she said, "Everything is fine," when nothing was, for all the times she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Samuel put the dish towel over his shoulder. He stood beside her, without touching, without speaking, simply present. And when Clara finally turned and rested her forehead against his chest, he placed his hand on her back, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she would break, and stayed there, still, steady, like an anchor that doesn't know it's an anchor until someone needs it in the middle of a storm. They stayed like that for a while, a time neither of them could measure. Thunder got out of bed and lay down at their feet, as if he wanted to participate in that moment that had no name but had form. Clara slowly moved away. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at Samuel, and in that look there was something new. Not gratitude, not dependence, not the desperate need of someone clinging to the first rescue that comes along. There was recognition. The recognition that there was, in the world, at least one person who saw her as she was, whole, with her cracks and her stitches and her scars and her imperfect human beauty. Samuel looked back. In his heart, which had been quiet for 6 years, which had grown accustomed to silence as eyes grow accustomed to darkness, felt something he thought he would never feel again. Warmth. Not desire, not passion, not the fleeting fire that burns and goes out. Warmth. The kind of warmth that comes from within and spreads slowly, like the morning sun warming a house that has been cold all night. Neither of them said anything about that moment, not that night, nor the nights that followed. But something changed. It changed the way the seasons change. Without warning, without a set date, just one day, You realize that the cold is gone and the flowers are blooming. Clara received an invitation to sell her embroidery at the weekly market in the neighboring town. A lady named Donna Hercelia, who had bought a set of embroidered towels and was delighted with them, introduced Clara to... Clara hesitated, not for lack of desire, but for lack of experience in occupying space. Her whole life had been about making herself small enough not to bother anyone, not to draw attention, not to be a target. The idea of placing her creations on a table, in full view of everyone, to be judged and evaluated, seemed like an impossible exhibition. It was Louisa who convinced her. The 6-year-old girl, who understood more than any adult around her, looked at her mother and said, "Mom, your things are the most beautiful I've ever seen." And Clara, who believed in almost nothing, believed her daughter. The first fair was on a Saturday in April. Clara set up a simple table with her tablecloths, embroidered dish towels, patchwork cushions, and 3 children's dresses she had sewn from leftover fabric. She stood behind the table with her hands crossed over her apron, her eyes downcast, waiting for someone to stop. And when the first woman stopped, picked up a dish towel embroidered with lavender and said, "How beautiful." Clara felt something rebuilding itself inside her, brick by brick, like a house that was in ruins and begins to be rebuilt. She sold almost everything that first Saturday. She returned home with money in her pocket and a list of orders that would keep her busy for weeks. Samuel was on the balcony when she arrived. Pedro ran to her, Louisa showed him a drawing she had made at school, and Trovan wagged his tail. Clara looked at that scene, the man on the balcony, the children running around, the dog, the house with the curtains she had made herself, and felt something so great it almost hurt. It was happiness. She came with fear because Clara didn't trust good things, but it was happiness nonetheless. Months passed. Clara's embroidery gained fame in the region. Orders increased. Donna Ercelia introduced her to a craft shop in the big city, and the shop owner was so impressed that he ordered 20 pieces at once. Clara bought a used sewing machine with her first big profit. Samuel helped set up a workspace for her in the back room. A wooden table, a shelf for the fabrics, good lighting. And when he finished setting everything up, he stood in the doorway, looking at Clara, who was gazing at the space, and said, "It's yours." 2 words that weighed as much as the world. It's yours. The first place, the first space, the first thing in Clara's entire life that was hers, not because someone allowed it, but because she built it. The relationship between Clara and Samuel continued to move at a pace that didn't obey clocks or calendars. There was no declaration, no planned first kiss, none of the rituals that love stories usually require. What happened was a rainy Sunday, and Clara was in the kitchen baking a cake, and Samuel came in to get coffee, and their shoulders touched by accident, and neither of them pulled away. They stayed there, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, while the coffee brewed and the rain pattered against the window and the cake baked in the oven. And in that minimal contact, there was more intimacy than in any hug Clara had ever received. After that, the touches became more frequent, but always small, always discreet, always with the delicacy of someone who knows they are touching something precious and fragile. A hand on the shoulder as they passed, fingers rubbing against each other as they handed her a plate. An adjustment to her hair that he made without thinking and then felt awkward about, like a teenager who doesn't know what to do with his own hands. Louisa noticed before everyone else. Children notice. One night, while Clara was putting her to bed, Louisa said, "Mom, Samuel, she really likes us, doesn't she?" Clara stroked her daughter's hair and replied, "She does, my daughter." "Not like Daddy," Louisa said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. At 6 years old, that girl already knew the difference between a love that binds and a love that protects. The legal situation resolved itself over time. Samuel helped Clara find a lawyer, a woman named Dr. Helena, who worked in the neighboring city and accepted pro bono cases. The divorce was complicated because Renato made everything difficult. He didn't show up for hearings, didn't sign documents, and spread lies. But Dr. Helena was the type who wouldn't be intimidated, and little by little things moved forward. Clara got custody of the children. The house remained with Renato, which didn't matter because Clara didn't want anything more to do with him. Not the house, not his name, not his memory. Renato remarried 6 months after his divorce was finalized. He married a younger woman who worked at a roadside bar. The town talked about it, as it always does, and then forgot, as it always forgets. And Clara, upon hearing the news, felt nothing. No relief, no anger, no sadness. Just a clean emptiness, like a room that has been emptied and is ready to receive new furniture. Clara and Samuel's first kiss happened one June night, almost 4 months after that first rainy night. They were on the back porch, as they usually did after the children went to sleep. The sky was clear, full of stars. Thunder slept between them, snoring softly. Clara was talking about a large order she had received, 30 embroidered towels for a hotel in the mountains, and suddenly stopped mid-sentence because she felt Samuel's hand on hers. She looked down. His fingers were large, rough, and calloused. Hers were small, nimble, marked by needles, and there, intertwined, they seemed to have been made to meet. Clara looked at him, Samuel looked at her, and the kiss came as inevitable things do, without decision, without planning, without that moment of doubt that precedes normal first kisses. He leaned in, she leaned in, and their lips met with a gentleness, which was almost a question. "May I? You may?" And then with a certainty that was almost an answer. "I'll stay. You'll stay." When they parted ways, Clara's eyes were shining and Samuel's face was as red as a boy's. Thunder woke up, looked at the two of them, yawned, and went back to sleep. And life went on. Life unfolded as it does for those who find their place, with work, routine, small problems, and small joys that intertwine to form something resembling happiness. Clara became known in the region as the embroidery artisan. Her work was sought after by shops, fairs, and hotels. She opened a small workshop in the back of her house where she taught other women to embroider, women who, like her, needed something that was their own. Louisa grew up bright and sensitive and had the habit of writing stories in notebooks that she kept under her pillow. Pedro ran around the yard as if the whole world fit there between the fence and the guava tree that Samuel had planted for him. Samuel was still sheriff. He was still doing night patrols. But now when he came home, the lights were on. There was the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the sound of children sleeping, an old dog sleeping on the rug, and a woman waiting for him on the porch with a smile that wasn't big, but was genuine. And for a man who had spent 6 years returning to a dark and silent house, that was everything. One day, almost a year after the night of the rain, Clara was sitting in her sewing workshop, working on a special embroidery, a large panel depicting a dirt road in the rain, with 3 silhouettes walking and the headlights of a car illuminating the path. Louisa came in and stood watching. "What is this, Mom?" Clara looked at the embroidery. Each stitch was a memory, each line of feeling she couldn't express with words but knew how to express with her hands. "It's the story of how we got here," she said. Louisa approached. She ran her fingers over the embroidery, the dirt road, the silhouettes, the headlights. "It was raining that night," she said. "Yours. And Samuel came to pick us up." "He came." Louisa was silent for a moment, then she smiled. "We were lucky, weren't we, Mom?" Clara looked at her daughter. She thought of everything she had lived through. The motherless childhood, the father who drank, the years with Renato, the nights she prayed for the day not to dawn. She thought of the rain, the road, the bare feet in the mud. She thought of Samuel, of his voice saying, "Come with me," of the warm milk, of the patchwork curtains, of the small touches, of the kiss on the balcony, of the life she was building stitch by stitch, like an embroidery that was finally taking shape. "It wasn't luck, my daughter," Clara said. "It was courage. The courage to leave a place where we weren't happy, even without knowing where we were going." That night, Clara hung the embroidery on the living room wall. Samuel arrived home from work, saw the panel, and stood in front of it for a long time. He didn't say, "How beautiful," this time. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the embroidered road, at the silhouettes, at the headlights, and his eyes shone in a way he wouldn't allow to shine in front of anyone. When Clara approached and placed her hand on his arm, he covered her hand with his and said, his voice choked with emotion, "Thank you. For what reason?" "Because he came with me." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. The children were asleep. Thunder rumbled on the carpet. The rain began to fall outside, fine, light, almost a caress, and the sound of it against the roof was like a song only they knew. The same rain that a year before had been a punishment was now a soundtrack. And Clara thought, without saying it aloud, that perhaps life isn't about finding a place where the rain doesn't fall, but about finding someone who will hold the umbrella with you. The house was silent. The embroidery on the wall, the children in their rooms, the dog on the rug, the man and woman in the living room, hand in hand, gazing at a road they had traveled together without knowing they were walking towards each other. And outside, the rain continued to fall on low hills, washing the dirt streets, filling the streams, watering the flowers that would bloom the following morning. Flowers that no one planted, but that life, sometimes when it finally decides to be fair, makes bloom. 2 years had passed since that March night. Samuel's house, which was now everyone's house, gained an extension in the back. A real studio with large tables, shelves full of colorful threads, and a wooden sign on the door that Louisa had painted with crooked letters. Clara's Studio. The business grew. 3 women from the village worked with Clara, and together they produced pieces that were sold in 5 shops in the region and at a monthly craft fair that attracted buyers from afar. Samuel proposed to Clara on an ordinary day, without preparation, without a ring, without any of the scenarios that people consider obligatory for a proposal. They were in the backyard. He was fixing the fence that Pedro had knocked down while playing. She was hanging clothes on the clothesline. He had a nail in his mouth and a hammer in his hand when he said, his voice slightly muffled by the nail, "Clara, marry me." She stopped, clothes in hand. She looked at him. He took the nail out of his mouth. And his gaze was the same as always, firm, present, without grand promises, without overly pretty words, just genuine. "I don't need a ring," he said. "I need you." Clara smiled. Not a small smile like the ones at the beginning. A full, open smile, the kind that uses her whole face and reaches her eyes. "I need you too," she said. They got married on the porch of the house on a Saturday in September, exactly on the same porch where Clara had arrived soaked that first night. The village priest officiated, even though he was the same priest who had made comments in the sermon months before, because priests, like everyone else, are capable of changing when they see the truth up close. Louisa was the maid of honor. Pedro carried the rings, simple, silver ones, bought with the money from Clara's embroidery. Trovon slept through the entire ceremony, but woke up to eat cake. Donna Herzelia cried. Dr. Helena came from far away to be there. Neighbors who had been whispering were now smiling. And Renato, who still lived at the other end of the village with his new wife, didn't show up. He wasn't invited. He wasn't missed. The day after the wedding, Clara woke up early, as usual. She made coffee, placed the cup on the table, and went to the kitchen window. The sun was rising over Colinas Basis, painting the sky orange and pink. The yard was green, the guava tree laden with fruit, the clothes on the line swaying in the morning breeze. Louisa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair disheveled and her storybook under her arm. Pedro came running after her, followed by Trovon, and Samuel, with his hair wet from his bath and the embroidered apron he never took off again, sat at the table and drank his coffee. Clara looked at them all, and she thought, for the first time without fear of thinking, "I deserve this. I didn't say it aloud, I didn't need to. Some truths are too big to fit into words. They fit into gestures, in a cup of coffee on the table, in an embroidery on the wall, in a daughter's hand holding the hem of her dress, in the headlights of a car cutting through the rain on a dark road. They fit into the silence that exists between two people who chose to stay. They fit into the space between one stitch and another of a line embroidered by hand, with care, with time, with the patience of someone who knows that the most beautiful things in life are never done in a hurry. The rain would fall again on Colinas Basis. It always does. But now, when it fell, Clara wouldn't be barefoot on the road. She would be home, in her home, with her children, her work, her old dog, and the man who, one March night, stopped his car by the side of the road and said the two simplest and most powerful words anyone can say to someone who has lost everything. "Come with me." And she went. And it stayed that way, and life finally made sense.